He flung the fruit like a thrown accusation. The guava hit the hot asphalt with a wet, bright sound that cut through the market chatter, a punctuation mark to something larger than its single splash. People stopped. The vendors' hands, small, knotted from years of sorting and selling, hovered over the scattered pile, as if time itself had tripped. Someone gasped. A child laughed nervously, then hushed. In the middle of the noise, a voice barked, sharp as a whistle. "Get out of my way!" Cop Humiliates street vendor. Didn't know she was mother of army captain and prosecutor. The word spread faster than the fruit could rot, because a boy in a doorway held up a phone and recorded everything. Leo's hands shook as he filmed. He had been running errands for his mother, and meant at first only to catch a moment of the lieutenant's swagger. Valenza loved theatrics, but he kept recording when the man stepped up to the stall and did what no authority should. Valenza leaned over and jabbed a finger at the vendor's chest, the uniform's badge catching the sun like permission. He knocked over the basket with the same careless motion someone might use to clear a path. Fruit scattered in a bright arc. He spat once, a small human thing with the force of contempt, and people felt it as if it touched their own mouths. Dona Lourdes stood like a face in a photograph, wrinkles mapped by the sun, apron tied at the waist, the few coins in her pocket a quiet ledger of daily survival. She did not fall, but her shoulders slumped. For a moment the market held its breath, as if waiting for her to rise or collapse. She collected guavas with hands that had raised 2 daughters into professions that made her quietly proud, one in uniform under other skies, the other in a courthouse downriver. The lieutenant laughed in the way a man with protection laughs. His laughter rolled off his shoulders and into the packed aisles. "Get that old woman out of here," he said, louder for the crowd to hear. "This place is a mess." The camera caught the spit as well as the fruit. It caught the shine of the badge and the tilt of his chin. It framed the crowd, frozen between pity and fear. It caught the tiny defiance in Dona Lourdes's eyes when she wrapped her apron tighter, as if holding a secret between the thread and the fabric. Leo uploaded the clip before his heart had stopped pounding. He sent it first to a number he had saved under the name Capita, because he trusted the woman who had once given him water and a first job helping carry sacks of cassava to market. Nadia Menezes, Nadja, had been a captain in a distant command. Leo knew she would be furious. He also knew Nadja would not sit on that fury. Within minutes, the clip had found its way from Nadja's phone to a desk across town that wore a different kind of authority. Samara Menezes, public prosecutor, was finishing a meeting when Leo's video arrived as a forwarded message. She watched it once, then twice. The first pass was for the facts, what happened. The second was for the tone, the smell of heat, the humiliation, the way men in uniforms sometimes confuse power with entitlement. Samara was raised to measure things by law and by quiet calculation. She kept a coffee ring on paperwork, not out of sloppiness, but because she worked late enough for it to happen. Her office smelled of paper and lemon cleaner and the faint, stubborn perfume her mother always wore. When Nadja sent the video with a single line, "You see this?" Samara's jaw tightened. She kept her fingers off the keyboard for a moment and let the image of the fallen guava embed. She thought of her mother's hands, the small house where the family ate guava jam on Sundays, of photographs taped to the kitchen wall, a young Nadja in uniform, a smaller Samara before the law. Her chest flipped, but the flip landed into strategy. Nadja's message came with heat. She stood at a base that smelled of wet leaves and diesel, surrounded by men who measured time by patrols. The jungle had taught her narrow patience and immediate action. She wrote to Samara in all caps once, "We move," then followed with a shorter note, "Tell me where she is. I can be there in 2 days." Samara replied with an address and a single word that was not cold but was clinical, documented. Samara did not call the press immediately. She did not post a comment. That would be to hand the moment to the offhand cruelty of the man who had made it. She had seen how headlines could flatten people into narratives too easy to consume and forget. Instead, she drafted a complaint, precise and serrated, and set in motion an administrative chain whose teeth she knew well. She was a prosecutor who believed in procedure. She also knew how to make procedure sting. Across the market, the crowd started to move as the temperature changed, the slight flurry that comes when an animal senses danger. Men in uniforms who had been idly watching made rituals of turning away. Vendors closed their umbrellas as if to hide. The ambient hum resumed, but a different current ran through it now, under the stalls and under the laughter. A woman in a red dress stooped to pick up a guava, and then, with a small act of tenderness, handed it back to Doña Lourdes without a word. That gesture traveled farther than any petition. The early victory came quickly because Samara made it precise. She used what she had: a complaint filed under the code that governed conduct of officers, photographs from Leo's phone authenticated by timestamps, witness statements from 2 vendors who had known Valença to be aggressive before. She requested an emergency administrative review. She requested Valença's immediate removal from the field pending investigation. She did not call for his ruin. She called for a suspension pending fact-checking. The legal language turned the lieutenant's swagger into a procedural violation. Valença was a man who expected applause for the weight of his uniform. He was also a man who expected that when trouble knocked at the door, someone with less power would be the one shuffled out. So when 2 officers arrived at his precinct with a formal request from the prosecutor's office, and later when the Internal Affairs Division called for him to be placed under investigation, his first response was disbelief, then anger. He called the decision political. He called it unfair. He kept his tone loud enough that a reporter who caught wind of the event would recall the voice as arrogant rather than wronged. When Samara walked into the police station, incognito, wearing a plain coat and no excess of authority, she felt the small satisfaction of a plan unfolding. She presented her credentials when asked, and did not shout or make a spectacle. Her power was in the pages she laid on the desk: timestamps, witness statements, a link to the viral video. She watched the lieutenant's face when the investigating officer read the call for removal. Valença's shoulders dipped as if the weight of his badge had become a question mark. He was taken to an administrative room and told not to leave the precinct. He was not arrested. Samara avoided language that would elevate the episode into a public law enforcement spectacle, but he was sidelined, watched by colleagues who had seen Samara's file enough to know that ignoring her could be costly. News outlets picked up the clip within hours. Samara had not wanted the spectacle, and yet could not deny the force of public eyes. Her office released a brief statement that sounded clinical. An investigation had been opened. A complaint had been registered. Anyone with relevant evidence should come forward. The line told the larger world something small but important. The law worked in this instance because someone in its engine had chosen to make it work. That night the market hummed with a different kind of talk. Some people celebrated as if an old wrong had finally been cleaned. Others worried because power did not relocate without retaliating. Dona Lourdes sat at home and cleaned guavas, smoothing cloths, running her hands over the bowls, in a ritual that connected the past to the present. She was proud. She could not hide it. Proud in a soft way that sometimes embarrassed her daughters. Her voice, when she spoke to the neighbors who came by, had a note of stubborn calm. "They will apologize," she said, not because she believed it so much as to steady the people leaning on her stoop. People must be made to remember how to be decent.
In a small living room some miles away, Samara checked the thread of messages again and then dialed Leo to tell him to keep everything safe. He laughed, a sound half incredulous, half proud. "I just pointed the phone," he said. "I never thought—" He trailed off, trying to arrange his surprise into a sentence. Samara listened and then said gently, "Good. Leave the originals with me."
"Don't let anyone take them." Nadia's reaction was different, elemental as thunder. She wanted to go down to the market and confront Valencia herself, to show hands that had once held an M16 what a woman's wrath could look like. But the distance between jungle and city is not measured only in miles. It is measured in commitments and orders. She sent voice clips full of sharp fragments. "I would have—" "No, Samara. Answer him." The soldier in her wanted direct action. The sister in her wanted the law to be a blade, not a blunt object. Samara steadied Nadia with a text that held both iron and silk. She promised action and prepared her sibling for the path she intended to take. "I will not let him walk away," she wrote. "I will not make this about theater. I will make it about facts. We do this by the book." Those words kept the soldier from stepping into an impulse that would later complicate everything. Nadia agreed, but her messages still came through as short, hot coal phrases that warmed the space in Samara's pocket. The temporary triumph was a small valley in a mountain range that had not finished moving. Samara understood power in neighborhoods and in courthouses. She also understood how quickly power can retaliate, and that retaliation seldom wore the same uniform as the initial offense. The man who had flung guavas had a protector or two, and the man who protected him had friends in higher places. When someone parts the surface of corruption, the current underneath quickens. It did not take long for the current to show its first eddy. Word traveled to a different office, one with a heavier carpet and a voice that spoke in circuits of influence rather than case numbers. Golvia, the councilman who kept his name attached to local development projects and whose smiles were as measured as his campaign contributions, had an interest in keeping certain things neat. Local politicians rely on a flow: favors given, favors returned, inconveniences stilled. It annoyed him to see a public humiliation turn into a media moment that implicated one of his instruments, Lieutenant Valencia. Maybe he had not ordered the humiliation, maybe he had merely allowed the culture that birthed it, but he saw patterns in the clip, the badge, the ease, and he felt exposure creeping toward his doorstep like mildew. Golvia's first response to the news was to call his legal counsel, then his lieutenant in the precinct, then his own fixer. He did not shout, he did not need to. He made a series of calls that were bland in tone and precise in intent. "We can control this," he told a man named Ademar, who answered in a voice that always made Golvia feel the rightness of his own decisions. "Make sure nothing spreads that hurts the man who works for me." Ademar was a man who understood leverage and the soft way fear could be arranged. He prowled neighborhoods and collected loyalty the same way he collected debts. He had, in the past, done favors that left no fingerprints. For Golvea, Ademar's quiet efficiency was worth whatever currency they had exchanged. Yet even Ademar had to move carefully. The video was a public eye sharp as a knife. The kind of manipulation that had worked a year ago would attract attention now. Back at her office, Samara began closing doors in the corridors of bureaucracy. She set meetings to ensure the internal affairs team had full access to the precinct's footage. She authorized subpoenas for patrol dash cams. She called in a favor from a colleague at the municipal press office for a limited, factual statement, nothing sensational, nothing framed for headlines, but enough to keep the honest cameras watching. Those moves felt like setting a net under a performer walking a wire.
They were legal, they were methodical. They were, Samara thought, the sort of slow, irritable insect that could make a spider uneasy. Samara also made a slower, human move. She went back to the neighborhood to check on her mother without taking a camera. When she walked into the small kitchen, it was dusk, and the house smelled faintly of guava jam and lemon soap. Dona Lourdes was seated at the table, mending a net, the same way people mend what they know will wear. She looked at Samara as if measuring whether the woman in the door was the little girl who had once resisted leaving home. She reached out, and Samara took her hand. It was a small reconciliation between power and tenderness. No speech, only the clasping of fingers that said, "I am here, and I will do what I can." That evening, the family gathered in a quiet way. Nadia phoned and spoke short, bracing words, and Ricardo, Samara's assistant, texted a line of support and an offer to take on logistical details. Leo came by to tell them the video had been shared widely. People from further afield were talking about the simple dignity of an old woman. The market had, in that odd and sometimes wonderful way of cities, become a place where people remembered the poor with a vigor usually reserved for celebrities. For a moment, there was hope that a public eye, even if blind to everything else, would be enough. The sight of Valença removed from duty made people feel that the scales had shifted. The viral clip belonged now to the market and to the mother and to a boy who had filmed in a doorway. But power rarely submits gracefully. When a man with influence feels a cornered corner, he does not usually admit fault and walk away. He girds, he recruits, he seeks counterweights. Gouveia began to gather his. He sat at a heavy table that smelled faintly of cigar smoke and the leftover ink of campaign leaflets. Surrounded by men whose loyalty was bought in small, precise units, he spoke in the voice of someone mapping a chessboard. "We cannot let this be a precedent," he said. "We cannot let public ridicule turn into a rule."
His words fed into a plan that was not yet visible, a plan that would move like a staged play, careful, rehearsed, and scripted to produce a different headline, not "Cop Humiliates Street Vendor," but "Vendor Arrested for Trafficking." It was an ugly thought, because the machinery that kept men like him secure had a way of manufacturing facts from the air if they controlled the right officers, the right moments, the right cameras. He did not want violence, he wanted plausible narratives, and plausibility could be built the same way houses were built, by laying down one small block at a time. Samara did not know the first pieces of that plan yet. She knew only that the night felt thinner than usual, the sound of traffic sharper. She slept badly, thinking of paperwork and witness statements, of the way a microphone could catch a confession and a camera could capture a dirty hand. She had pushed one of the great cogs of local power and felt its tremor run through the city's skin. In the days that followed, Samara and her small team, Ricardo, whose efficiency pleased her like a neat ledger, Leo, whose phone had become evidence, and a quiet investigator she trusted to speak little and notice everything, worked through procedural knots. They cataloged witnesses, asked for recorded statements, checked for patterns of misconduct by Valencia. Each paper they filed was a small legal bar. Each step was a way to anchor whatever justice might be possible in the rocks of procedure. But news, when it decided to shift, could move faster than law. One morning, scrolling through a feed that had become both a tool and a danger, Samara saw a headline that made her stomach drop. "Local vendor arrested in narcotics bust." The photograph that accompanied the story was unmistakable. It was the market, the same angle as Leo's clip, but the subject behind bars looked like the same woman who had sold guavas in the sun.
The caption suggested that material had been found in her basket and that the arrest had been executed by the very precinct where Valencia had been placed under review. Samara's hand tightened around the phone until the bone at her wrist smiled with pressure. Her first impulse was a juridical series of steps: file motions, seek release, call the investigator. Her second, deeper impulse was a human rupture. Her mother, taken in the name of a narrative that smelled of fabrication. The air went out of her in a small sound that could have been a laugh or a sob. She called Ricardo, then Leo, then Nadia, who was in transit. The lines filled with rapid commands and muffled disbelief. Documents were requested, videos demanded. Samara's mind moved through legal possibilities like a chess master who suddenly found a move blocked. She had used the law to challenge power. Now power had used the law back, or a version of it. On the courthouse steps that day, she stood where she more often stood as an advocate, not as a daughter.
Reporters had returned, more insistent than before. Cameras sought a face that could stitch together the sudden narrative: prosecutor versus vendor, law versus public spectacle. Samara did not give the crowd a speech. She read a short statement about the importance of due process and promised a full inquiry. Her voice was steady, but inside the gears of her mind were not merely legal arguments. They were the private calculations of someone who understood how to run a tight net, and how, occasionally, nets had to be retied when they caught unexpected things. When she returned home that evening, the small house smelled different, like disinfectant and fluorescent lights, and the air of interrogation that follows an arrest. Donna Lourdes sat at the table, not in the way of someone who had been convicted, but like someone who had been shuffled through a place not built for the dignity of her hands. Her eyes were red at the edges, but her chin was set. She whispered things she had learned by endurance: food scrimped, the small rituals of prayer in the corner, the calendar where her daughter's milestones were marked in pen. Samara thought of hope and fear as two rivers about to meet. She could see how one might drown the other. The legal moves she would make could secure bail, press for speedy review, demand footage. But she also knew that when a man like Gouveia felt pressured, his reactions were not often straightforward or polite. She sat with her mother for a long time. They did not speak of strategy, they spoke of small things: the recipe for guava jam, the exact measurement of sugar that made everything taste like memory. Those domestic rituals grounded Samara in a truth that felt purer than law. Dignity was not a thing recovered only by verdicts. It was the way people were held by their family when the world insisted on letting them go. Outside, the city moved on. Headlines shifted like the weather. The clip that had shifted everything remained in circulation, but now there were other images: police cars, the blur of protesters, the faces of people who recognized themselves in Donna Lourdes and felt a new, emboldening indignation. Samara took one legal step after another, but each had a counterpart in the world of leverage she had learned to use in courtrooms. A quiet leak to a reporter who had shown fairness before. A call to an internal affairs official who was not yet compromised. A request for footage from a repair shop down the street that might have recorded the precinct's comings and goings. She did not ask for anything illegal. She asked for records, for transparency, for the slow unspooling of truth by means that the state recognizes. Meanwhile, the city's undercurrent sketched its own map. Gouveia's ally, Ademar, moved through small circles of influence, collecting promises and breathing into ears.
Capitão Bastos, an officer who preferred orders to paperwork, answered a call and made a schedule that placed men in positions where evidence could be useful if found, and reporters could be misled if guided. These were small decisions, not overt conspiracies. They were the kind that built plausible narratives. By the time Samara assembled the brief for the emergency hearing, she sensed a campaign against her mother that had been crafted with an eye toward plausibility.
The word planting did not yet appear in the official documents, but the pattern of actions, the sudden discovery, the arrest timed to create its own story, left a residue that felt manufactured. Dona Lourdes sat in a holding room smaller than her kitchen and watched her daughter move through hallways that smelled of lemon and law. "If they will not be decent to people," she said quietly once, "they will answer to their own consciences, or at least to the law." Her voice was not bitter. It was as if she offered a small benediction for the kind of justice that could be summoned by good work. Samara did not sleep that night. She reread every report, cross-checked details, asked for the chain of custody of the alleged material found in her mother's basket. She clipped into her role as if donning armor, not the theatrical armor of headline-making lawyers, but the plain armor of people who keep their work in lists and motions. She told her team to prepare for a media fight and a legal one, and to expect that the other side would not limit itself to clean procedure. And in the middle of all those moves, a man who had once flung a fruit and spat at dignity sat in a room that no longer allowed him a free path. Tenente Valenza watched the news and felt the first pinprick of unease that comes when someone responds to you not with fear, but with law. He could not yet see everything that was forming. He could only see the beginning of consequences. The story had widened beyond an act of public humiliation. It had become a quiet war of narratives and legal maneuvers. Samara realized with a clarity that both calmed and frightened her that she had summoned a process that would test her skills and her family's endurance. The market, the guava, the phone recording, they were no longer isolated incidents, but parts of a larger mechanism. When the morning brought the latest bulletin, an edited clip, a new headline that suggested deeper rot at the market, Samara's phone lit up with messages from people she had never met, offering support and outrage. It warmed her like an ember and reminded her that public opinion could be an ally, but also a wild thing. She arranged to speak to her mother at 11, to be at the courthouse at noon, to review evidence at 3. At 9:30, while she waited for a conference call, Ricardo texted that a new source wanted to meet. Leo sent a short video, a shaky clip of a man from the precinct arriving at the market 2 days before the incident to measure routes and check cameras. It was the kind of thread that, when stitched with others, might reveal more than a single frame. Samara felt the pattern opening, not neatly, but insistently. She was aware, too, of how thin the line was between lawful pressure and the temptation to play the city's games on its own terms. She did not trust the line that promised swift, clean justice without effort. She also knew the moral hazard of playing dirty. She made a private promise that night in the quiet of her office to wield every lawful instrument she had and to stop should any move require stepping into the dark. The public still watched. The clip of the fruit remained, but now there were other images forming in small rooms and behind doors, whispers in corridors, checks on cameras, a man in a suit who preferred to pay attention only to returns. The story was no longer a single sliver of cruelty. It was a beating network of cause and effect. And then, as afternoon light moved across her desk, Samara received the single message that made the world sharpen. Footage had surfaced, showing a hurried exchange outside a local warehouse recorded 2 nights before the initial incident. It was not explicit proof of anything criminal, but the angle suggested coordination, not coincidence. The frame of 2 men meeting, the way one hand slid a small package under cloth, the hurried nods, these were the kind of details that compounded into suspicion. Her phone buzzed with the incoming call from Nadia. "Stay calm," Nadia said, though her voice was a thin wire of controlled storm. "Whatever you do, keep it clean. Let me know if I should come."
Samara inhaled, the motion becoming a small ritual of undeniable steadiness. "We have to be smarter than they are," she said. "We have to be 10 steps ahead and 10 steps lawful." Outside, the market made its own noises, foot traffic, a radio playing somewhere, a woman bargaining in a voice worn smooth by practice. Inside, Samara charted the moves she would make next, not with the boastful language of vengeance, but with the precise terms of subpoenas and authenticated footage, with requests for chain of custody logs and verified witness statements. She reached for the law as a tool, not a cudgel. The day was folding into evening when a headline arrived that none of them had expected, at least not yet. The feed announced an arrest that seemed improbably timed. The photograph attached showed a woman in handcuffs, the market in the background, and the caption stated in neutral newsprint that contraband had been found in the vendor's stall. Samara felt the fabric of that claim as a direct blow. She read the brief report through the lens of experience and saw small inconsistencies that could be probes into a story designed to distract the public from a different thread.
She closed her eyes for a beat and then opened them onto the files she would build. The work of undoing a manufactured narrative required time and records and cold patience. It required that the law be used in all its tedious manners: motions, subpoenas, affidavits, the slow sifting of credible from implausible. Samara knew she had allies who would help: a journalist who valued truth over sensation, an investigator who kept his conscience folded like a map, a soldier sister with patience that had edges, and a boy with 2 hands and a phone. The clock in her office moved toward the point where she would have to stand before cameras again, only this time not for a statement, but to unpick a different thread, to explain why an elderly woman could not have been a trafficker and why the timestamps on the official report did not line up with the market's reality. Everything hung on 3 things she could not control completely: time, the chain of custody, and the willingness of truth to show itself under public pressure. She started drafting motions and calls, but as she moved, she felt another emotion rise, a kind of cold fury, precise and controlled, that tasted like the metal of a scale being righted. She did not know how far Gouvea's reach extended. She did not know if the officers who would be called to testify would be men of conscience or men with a habit of loyalty to a single kind of power. She only knew this: the small act of cruelty had grown into a political moment, and moments like that invited a hard response. Her family's dignity was now a thing to protect by law and likelihood. As the sun slid low, she looked at her mother again and watched the way Dona Lourdes folded her hands as if preparing for prayer or perhaps another day of selling guavas. She felt the weight of the moment: the market in the morning, the courthouse in the afternoon, and the private knowledge that a city's institutions can both save and betray. She set her jaw and made one more call to the investigator. "We keep everything documented," she said. "No improvisation, no rogues. We will not give them the chance to say we played the same games. We will outwork them inside the law." The investigator's answer was terse and competent. "We'll meet at dawn. We'll start with the chain of custody for the evidence listed in the arrest. We'll check cameras along the route. We'll get the timestamps cross-checked." Samara hung up and sat with the silence. The first victory, the prompt sidelining of Valencia, had opened a door. Now the door had been used against her mother. She thought for a moment of how small gestures make large histories: a tossed guava, a recorded clip, a signature on an administrative form. Those small things had created a sudden swell that now seemed determined to drown her mother. She rose from her chair and walked to the window. The city breathed below, an organism of ordinary violence and unremarkable kindness.
Somewhere, Adamar might be making a move that would fit neatly into a manufactured story. Somewhere else, a reporter might be checking her messages. Somewhere, a boy who had only meant to save an image on his phone sat at home thinking that he had started something too big for him to understand. Samara put her hand on the glass and felt the faint heat of the day lingering. She thought of the law as both lever and mirror. It could lift heavy things, and it could also reflect the uglier parts of the city if those parts were let into its spaces. She decided, with the slow, deliberate certainty of someone who had learned to trust method, that she would not let the uglier part win. She gathered the files, the calls, the messages, a mosaic of evidence that would either prove a pattern or show that someone had bent facts to a will. She would build it not for revenge, but for return, to return dignity to a woman who had been humiliated on a hot street, to return a measure of faith to neighbors who had watched and turned away, to return the idea that the law, when applied with rigor, could act as an instrument of repair. Outside the window, the market's voice faded into the evening. Inside, the phone vibrated with one more text, a short clip, a small piece of a larger puzzle. Samara opened it and watched a man she did not know talk softly on a phone, naming places and times. The clip was shaky, but the voice was clear enough to prick at an edge of truth. Samara set it into the file and began the long task of asking for the records that would either guard that truth or let it be buried. She did not know yet what the next day would bring. She only knew the path forward, methodical, legal, and relentless in the collection of facts. She tightened her notes, breathed once, and stepped out into the cooling air to be with her mother at the little kitchen table where guava jam waited like a memory. The city did not promise clean endings, but for the first time since the guava hit the pavement, she felt the steadiness of a plan underfoot, one that would have to move faster than a headline, but always, insistently, inside the law. If this story is moving you, hit like and subscribe. There are more pieces of this fight to follow. Samara did not pretend the next hours would be easy. She had built a net of motions and subpoenas, of witnesses and camera angles. She had trusted people who answered when she called. But she also knew that the city had other instruments, friends in carpeted offices, men who smelled of cigar and certainty, people who could shape a story with a single well-placed photo. Her plan had to be faster than gossip and cleaner than rumor. She began at the edges, where small things often revealed a pattern. Ricardo brought her the repair shop footage Leo had flagged, a security camera on a corner that looked away from the market but caught the alley adjacent to the precinct. The clip had a man in a plain jacket, Ademar, checking his phone, then slipping a small parcel into his coat as another man, a uniformed officer, hurried past. The angle was grainy, but timestamps and a receipt from a nearby bakery gave the fragment context. It was not a confession, but it was a breadcrumb. Samara placed it carefully in the folder marked Probable Cause. She worked through the night with the investigator she trusted most, a woman named Elena, who had the patience to cross-reference logins and the temperament to read a face. They subpoenaed shift rosters, asked for fuel logs, and cross-checked patrol routes. Where the official paper trail ended in neat boxes, Elena chased the human frictions. Who had been late for a shift? Who had stepped away for 15 minutes when a van rolled through? Who had called out sick after a meeting with a politician? Nadia moved like a weather front, fast, intentional, precise. She did not come down to the city the way civilians imagine soldiers arrive. She came wearing plain clothes and a quiet that made people stand straighter. Her network was not legal briefs and municipal memos, but radio calls and disciplined observation. She found men who could say they had been asked to be in the wrong place at the right time. She found one who had taken a payment and kept a part of it in silence until the shame of his pocket outweighed the fear of it.
He went to Nadia at a small cafe on the edge of town and spoke in a voice that trembled when it did not need to. He handed over a receipt and a name, Capitão Bastos. The meat of the case began to settle into form. Samara built a clean bridge from the crumbs to a warrant. She gave Elena the names. Elena looped them into affidavits. Richard, the brave local reporter Samara had trusted, wrote a short, precise piece that asked questions rather than issued accusations. The press piece was enough to make Gouveia look over his shoulder. It was not a shout, but a pinprick of attention that would make a man careful. Gouveia, for all his smoothness, was a man used to controlling narratives. He calibrated reaction and counter-reaction with the skill of a man who spent his life on campaign stages. He could not make the original clip disappear. He could, however, try to reframe and to punish so that others would remember the price of defiance. The arrest of Dona Lourdes had been one stroke of that calculus, small, plausible, painful, and public. Samara had watched a system weaponize itself, with men choosing plausible deniability over basic decency. The retaliation escalated. Policemen who had once laughed at Valence's jokes now looked for ways to prove loyalty to the right houses. A rumor soup of accusations bubbled in the background. Allegations of tampered records, anonymous testimonies that contradicted Leo's frames. Someone left a threatening note on Samara's car. Someone else trailed Ricardo the length of his commute until he went in a different door.
Small acts, not violent, meant to rattle. Samara did what she did best. She read the small handwriting. She saw the pressure points Gouveia exploited and tightened her work there. A single irregularity in the chain of custody forms for the evidence seized from Dona Lourdes's stall, a missing signature, a stamp dated an hour after the reported seizure, became an avenue to pry open the frame. Elena tracked the logistics sheet that had accompanied the police van. It showed a detour that did not match the times noted in the official report. Samara demanded the original inventory tags and found, under a photocopier smear, a clerk's shorthand indicating the man who had been on duty. That shorthand led to a name, a junior officer who had recently been promoted after a favorable report from Capitão Bastos. Samara filed motions that were surgical rather than theatrical. Where Gouveia expected a parade, she gave him exhumation. She requested audited access to the precinct's storage room, and with it, the inventory logs for evidence. She asked for metadata from the precinct's recently upgraded phones. She did not broadcast demand. She built pressure in the places institutions are most sensitive, records and procedure. As the paperwork moved, the city simmered with quieter revelations. Leo collected witness statements from vendors who had been too afraid to speak earlier. One woman, Rosa, who sold beans 2 stalls down, remembered a man in plain clothes asking questions days before the incident, a man interested in routes and the placement of cameras. Another vendor, an old man who mended shoes, mentioned seeing Adema's truck idling outside the precinct late at night. Each recollection was small, but together they formed a mosaic that suggested orchestration. Samara's official recusal remained public and absolute. She had stepped aside from direct oversight of the formal case to avoid conflict of interest claims, giving her legal team, led by a colleague named Duarte, authority to file motions and represent the office. That move was both protective and strategic. It removed an easy line of attack for the opposition and allowed Samara to operate, insofar as she could, through rumor control and the tactical placement of facts. Duarte was careful and competent. He filed at times and in ways that made Gouveia look like a man nervy at the edges. The pressure mounted on Gouveia until he felt the city narrowing. He convened his inner circle in the same dark office where he had once signed funding papers with a flourish.
Ademar showed up with a face that kept its neutrality too well. Gouveia asked tough questions: who had leaked what, where the weaknesses lay, and Ademar assured him with the sort of calm that comes from a man who believes in being useful. The man believed, perhaps, that he could reorder the narrative with a single damaging release. They considered blackmailing witnesses. They considered paying a journalist.
They considered, with quiet savagery, making an example of Dona Lourdes again. What they did not expect was the quality of people who would hold their ground. The city's legal machine, when properly fed, could move quietly and decisively. Duarte, Samara's proxy, secured a subpoena for phone records that revealed a troubling frequency of calls between Edemar and an account registered to a shell company that had contracted security services for one of Gouveia's projects. The shell company had recently handled logistics for campaign materials and, inexplicably, for the precinct's overtime payments. The money trail did not always move in neat arrows, but it moved enough to make auditors curious. Samara, meanwhile, prepared a plan to create a public mirror, a controlled, lawful moment when Gouveia's actions would be put under a simple, undeniable light. She would not ambush him with lies or entrapment. She would build a tableau where his own choices would reveal him. The tableau began with a community meeting. Samara arranged for it to be a legal aid fair and a small press event. Free legal advice, a few counselors for victims of abuse, and a short panel on citizens' rights. A poster on the municipal board announced it as a gathering to discuss public safety and community policing. Gouveia, who loved photo ops and the feel of a crowd where he could be the center, was quick to RSVP through his staff. The fair would be in Itaipava, a neighborhood where his support had historically been solid. He would, as politicians do, relish the optics of being among his people. Samara put a wrinkle into the day that was entirely legal. She requested, through Duarte, an open meeting with a municipal audit team to discuss security contracts. The audit team accepted and scheduled the meeting at a hall adjacent to the fair. With lawful authority and an honest investigator present, Samara invited a small set of witnesses to attend those meetings: vendors, the junior officer who had signed for the inventory tags, and one reluctant municipal clerk who possessed a stack of receipts and the memory of odd instructions. The presence of an audit team and a press corps at neighboring tables meant Gouveia would be in a public cross-current. The choice to attend would be his. Nadia prepared the less public portion of the plan. She worked with a colonel who owed her a favor from long ago. He agreed to position an internal affairs unit nearby, not to spy, but to be ready should legal grounds for arrest arise. They had to operate within legal warrants and probable cause. They had to move when the case was ironclad. Nadia arranged for discreet observation teams to monitor movement at key exits. The teams were uniformed officers from another precinct, so there could be no claim of staged showmanship. The intent was not theatricality, it was containment. On the morning of the fair, the sun was soft, the market tables a palette of cotton and color.
Dona Lourdes arrived, clutching a small cloth bag of jam to show the attendees, a gentle reminder of what they were defending. She would not be a prop for the event. She would tell, if asked, only of how the market felt that day, of the ways dignity had been undone. Her voice would be simple and true. Gouveia arrived with a camera-friendly smile and a polishing team. He walked past the booths, shaking hands, telling the camera how much he loved the community. He was approachable and practiced, and clean of the kind of messy mistakes that hang men like him. He posed for photographs that would later be used as evidence of his public persona. Samara watched him from the edge of the room, quiet, alongside Duarte and Helena. She felt oddly like someone waiting for a piece of a clock to click into place. The audit team began asking neutral questions about past contracts. The junior officer, who had signed the inventory handwriting, sat in the third row, fidgeting, watching the man who had once been his superior move among people he had been taught to simulate loyalty toward. The crucial moment was small and human. Ademar stepped out of the throng and into a quiet side corridor to take a call. He did not know he was visible through a reflection in a shop window where a vendor had propped a mirror to catch the sun. The mirror cut his silhouette into a frame that a neighbor, Leo, happened to notice. Leo had come to help and to watch. He had his phone because an honest man never knows when the world will need a record. From a distance, he recorded Ademar speaking on the phone, and although the audio was thin, he captured enough. A voice outlining payment amounts and referencing a basket exchange that smelled suspiciously like the language of logistics. Leo's shaky clip echoed around the room in a way he could not have predicted. A journalist friend, Humiliates, recognized the coordinates and asked a pointed question at a microphone. Why had a man been checking the precinct's cameras days earlier? Ademar tensed. Gouveia, standing near the stage, blinked as if someone had turned a light on his face. The small public moments multiplied into something Gouveia did not control. The junior officer, under the honest scrutiny of an audit agent, and with the courage that comes from being no longer willing to bear the weight alone, told a version of events that matched the repair shop footage and the timestamps Helena had found. He admitted that he had filled out certain forms that day at hastened direction. He remembered with the uneasy specificity of a man who had once obeyed without question a conversation in which someone had said, "Make it look right." The phrase landed in the hall like a kind of legal echo. Under questioning, the pleadings and the pieces had to be explained. Duarte moved with light speed through paperwork, laying copies of receipts and signed affidavits on an auditor's desk. He requested access to the precinct storage and the recorded chain of custody for items seized from the market. The auditor, seeing what he had seen, agreed to a temporary hold. Gouveia reacted as men who felt the ground under them loose react, with anger that blurts, and then with calculation. He was escorted politely but firmly from the meeting by two officers unconnected to his precinct. He argued into the microphone, insisting he had done nothing wrong. Cameras rolled. His agitation made for worse optics than his posed smiles had earlier. The crowd that had once cheered him when he handed out ribbons now murmured, some left, some stood transfixed. As the audit team and Duarte solidified probable cause, warrants were drafted. They were narrow and specific and built on the paper trail Samara's team had assembled. Receipts, time-stamped CCTV, witness testimony, irregularities in inventory. The warrants listed specific names and targeted specific accounts. When the warrants were presented to the judge signed because the documents made a reasonable, lawful case. Arrests, when they come, are never cinematic in the way fiction promises. They are bureaucratic and efficient, and, when properly done, intended to uphold dignity even in the moment of restraint. The teams moved in with an authority that had been earned through paperwork and patience. They did not shout. They did not have to. Ademar was taken at the meeting's edge with the same hand that had once transferred packets into pockets folded behind his back. Capitan Bastos was asked to come in for questioning at his station. He complied, unaccustomed, perhaps, to the idea that a man might decline without consequence. Gouveia was given a chance to answer the allegations. He declined to speak in a way that extricated him, instead allowing his legal counsel to begin the standard maneuvering of letters and denials. For the cameras, his face was pensive and tight. He was escorted away not because a mob demanded it, but because the system, slow, tedious, and sometimes maddeningly inert, had been supplied with the documents it needed to act. The city watched,
and the narrative that had once been cop humiliates vendor now had room to expand into alleged scheme uncovered. Newspapers that favored the politician still protested procedural overreach. Others called the events a long overdue accountability. The public, who in the first act had watched and turned away, now watched and debated. Citizens argued about the meaning of evidence and the slow churn of due process. Samara saw in that argument the possibility of a lesson. Institutions can be tools for both harm and repair. Attention, when persistent and legal, can be an engine for change. Inside a detention room that smelled like antiseptic and paper, Dona Lourdes sat on a bench as a legal representative read to her the terms of an agreement that would return her to the street. Her release was not immediate. Procedural steps remained.
But the tide had turned enough that a judge viewed the irregularities and ordered an expedited review. The items seized from her stall were logged, photographed, and then held pending laboratory verification. Not that any lab was likely to find the kind of cash alleged in the initial report. The suggestion that her basket had been a vessel for trafficking began, under the bright glare of judicial scrutiny, to look improbable. When Samara walked into the room where her mother sat, the energy between them was small and a little wild, joy tempered by the long shadow of injury. They embraced the way people do when they have been allowed, by luck or law, to breathe again. Nadia had flown in once the arrests were underway. She arrived in the plain clothes of someone who wanted to avoid cameras, but whose presence made the room steadier. The three of them, mother and daughters and the boy Leo, who had begun this, sat and ate guava jam from a jar Samara had brought, an odd little victory that tasted like preservation. There were legal consequences to follow. Capitan Bastos and Ademar would face administrative charges. Investigations would proceed into the precinct's records. Gouveia would find himself under scrutiny he had not intended. Duarte pushed for formal indictments where the evidence supported them. Elena continued to comb for documents that would translate suspicion into sanction. Samara watched the public theater but refused to be its center. She let the law do the work it was designed to do, even as she kept a careful eye on the politics that buzzed around it. The day Dona Lourdes walked back into the market, the sun sat low and warm, as if nothing had happened, and yet everything had. Vendors laid out their wares with hands that trembled a little less than before. People offered small apologies, awkward enough, when they saw her standing again at her stall. She tied her apron, set the jars out in a neat row, and spoke with a voice that had the steady charm of someone who had survived storms. The community did not move in a single, clean direction. Some people continued to side with power because power was comfortable. Others leaned toward the idea that ordinary decency deserved better protection. The arrests had not fixed the system that allowed the humiliation to happen. There were still men at desks who would twist answers, and men in uniforms who would, under stress, chose friends over facts. Samara did not imagine she had cleared such deep waters. She had, instead, exposed a pathway where the law could cut and hold. Gouveia's fall was not instantaneous. He hired lawyers, he issued statements, he protested his innocence in the columns and the morning shows that still favored his network. He made the predictable claims of political persecution. Some people believed him. Others felt the shape of the evidence. The process would take months. Courts were slow to render judgments, measured and methodical by design.
But the initial arrests had signified something. The city, for once, had allowed the instruments of accountability to work rather than to be tools of silence. Samara kept working on the case file even when the immediate fury had cooled. She prepared for depositions and cross-examinations. She and Duarte ensured all the warrants were airtight, all chain of custody logs complete.
She pressed for the release of material that would clear her mother's name in the eyes of the public, not only through acquittal, but through transparent process. She wanted documents that would show how the planted narrative had been constructed, so that others might see the mechanics of manipulation and perhaps be less vulnerable to it. In quieter moments, she returned to her mother's kitchen. They cooked together, folding sugar into pots of jam like two women stitching memory back together. Conversation turned sometimes to the small, what the neighbors said, the price of sugar at the market, and sometimes to the more complicated. Samara found that the act of making jam was a small liturgy of repair: fruit, heat, attention, and patience. It was the opposite of the public cruelty that had so quickly been inflicted. It was a way of gathering the day's fragments and rendering them edible again. Nadia, meanwhile, used her time to quietly commend men who had found their conscience. She hugged the young junior officer who had spoken and promised to watch over him as he faced professional backlash. She met with the colonel who had provided her tactical support and acknowledged in a private tone that the military world and the civil world touched in strange and dangerous ways. She and Samara agreed, quietly, that they would not celebrate with triumphalism. The true measure of victory would be whether the market and its people felt safer for longer. The public reaction was mixed. Some declared the episode a turning point. Others declared it a media-fed fluke. The truth, Samara thought, sat somewhere between headline and history. Power, she knew, would regenerate in new forms unless systems were reformed. She filed a series of recommendations with municipal leaders, simple, concrete things: better chain of custody protocols, oversight of precinct liaison relationships with political offices, protections for vendors. Whether those recommendations would be adopted was not up to her alone. Weeks later, the indictment papers were filed. Ademar faced charges related to corruption and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Bastos faced a set of administrative charges and possible criminal referral. Gouveia faced questions that would follow him through a calendar of proceedings. For the media, it was a slow drip of accountability. For Dona Lourdes and the market, it was a kind of reclaiming. Vendors could sell their fruit in daylight and not think that a hand would scoop dignity away.
The courtroom scenes that followed were procedural, full of witness lists and cross-examinations that tried to press the edges of memory into contradictions. Samara did not testify as a prosecutor. She had recused, but she provided documents and let Duarte take the rhetorical floor. The public lawyer argued in measured terms. Here are the receipts. Here is the tape. Here is the chain of custody discrepancy. The defense argued zealously about political bias and press pressure. Judges listened. Sometimes justice is the slow chorus of reason assembling itself against impulse. After the last witness testified and the judge had listened, there were small administrative reprimands and the threat of official censure. Some men lost their positions. Others faced transfers that removed them from the precincts where they had once held sway. The system had acted, not perfectly, not in a way that would erase pain or guarantee the future, but enough to make a pattern visible and perhaps harder to replicate. On a quiet Sunday, a month after the arrests, Samara, Nadia, and Dona Lourdes sat on the stoop of their home while neighbors brought over pieces of fruit and the smell of cooking drifted warm from open windows. They were not safe in the sense of always being free from harm, but they were safe enough to laugh about a story Samara told of her first courtroom victory years ago. The small vanity of a prosecutor who had once thought she could solve everything with precedent. They laughed because the laughter did the work of ordinary human mending. It was not triumphal, it was humble and real. When asked later what had been the turning point, Leo would say the simplest thing.
he had held up his phone. He knew, in the antiseptic way that small acts sometimes know, that it had set a chain in motion none of them fully anticipated. But he also knew that the phone alone could never have done the work. It had taken a prosecutor willing to be precise, a soldier willing to hold watch, an investigator willing to read forms like maps, and a neighborhood willing, eventually, to speak. The end of the public chapter did not mean the end of the work. Samara kept writing letters, attending meetings, and nudging for reforms. She visited the market often and watched Dona Lourdes serve customers with a dignity that had been tested and, in a small way, strengthened. The guava jam recipe remained written on a scrap of paper pinned to the kitchen wall. 2 cups of fruit to 1 of sugar, and a long simmering. It was a recipe for patience as much as for preserves. The police lieutenant who had first flung the fruit, Valença, had been suspended pending further investigation. Men like him often found new places to assert unexamined power. Samara knew that the city's institutions could still fail at protecting ordinary people. She also knew that the sum of small legal acts, of citizens watching and insisting, could make it harder for future humiliation to happen in public so easily. In the weeks that followed, minor reforms took root in municipal meetings. Vendors were invited to sit on oversight panels about policing in markets. A legal hotline was set up for small stallholders to report abuse. The changes were not enough to alter everything, but they were signs. The market, once only the background of neglect, had become a site of advocacy. At the heart of it, the story remained simple. An old woman's hands, a boy's phone, daughters who refused to let a public humiliation go unchallenged. They had not engineered a utopia. They had exposed a mechanism and used the law to stop it. The moral question, whether it was right to use the machinery of power to fight power, remained open. Samara answered it by insisting on method and by refusing to cross the line into illegality or spectacle. She had used leverage precisely because it was lawful, and because, in the layers of a city, lawful pressure can sometimes be the most effective lever of all. In the market, the toppling basket became a motif people remembered but did not reenact. Children played among rows of fruit, while an older woman called from the stall, laughing. The jar of guava jam sat on a small shelf behind Doña Lourdes, and on Sunday afternoons, neighbors asked for a spoonful and a story about what dignity feels like when it is returned. Samara stood in the doorway of her mother's house one evening, watching the streetlights come up, thinking of the small legal acts that had to be performed if a city was to be decent to its own people. She thought not of the applause, but of the work, of the motions and the affidavits and the patient collection of facts. She thought of Nadia's steady presence and Leo's nervous courage. She thought of Duarte's calm, of Elena's patience, and of the vendors who, finally, had made a decision to say what they had seen. They had exposed corrupt patterns, and some men would be held to account, others would find ways to survive. Justice did not always conclude in the polite finality of a single verdict, but it could be a process that made visible the things a city sometimes attempts to hide. In that visibility, Samara found a certain hope, not the naive hope that the world would be perfect, but the steadier hope that when people organized with law and courage, the balance could tilt. Doña Lourdes pressed a spoon of jam into Samara's hand. She smiled in the way of someone who had seen many seasons. "Keep the jar," she said, because the jam would not last forever, and because they all needed a taste of what warm things can do. "Remember to add a little more lemon next time. It keeps things honest." They laughed at that, a small domestic correction, and the sound was the ordinary music of life. The city did not end its small cruelties overnight. Power rearranged itself and polished new stories. But for a while, in that neighborhood, people found the courage to refuse humiliation and the willingness to speak when they saw it.
The law, when used carefully and without spectacle, had been a blade for repair. If you were moved by this story, subscribe for more real stories of justice, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments.